There are nights when the world itself seems to hold its breath, when thunder cracks so close to the earth that even the bravest creatures tremble. On the edge of whispering pines, where the forest meets a sea of windswept prairie, Ella Carter braced herself against one of those nights. The wind battered the little animal rescue shelter, rattling every window, driving sheets of rain sideways across the porch. Inside, Ella stood alone in the glow of a single lantern, listening to the storm's rage. Her hands were busy, sorting medical supplies, checking on a half-healed stray dog, pretending she wasn't haunted by the memory of a life she'd left behind in the city, a career that crumbled, a love that never came home. The silence between the bursts of thunder felt heavier than her own regrets. That's when she heard it. Faint at first, a high, shrill cry, barely audible over the roar of the wind. Ella paused. Was it the wind, or... There it was again, desperate, animal, panic. She dropped the gauze in her hand, heart thudding in her chest. Something was out there. She grabbed her waterproof jacket, shoved her feet into muddy boots, and snatched her emergency medical kit from the hook by the door. In the drawer, her hands closed around the cold metal of a flare gun. Last, a heavy flashlight. She stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain slap her face, blinking hard. Darkness swallowed the world beyond the porch, broken only by the wild flicker of lightning. Ella pushed forward, the beam of her flashlight shivering through the downpour. The cries grew louder, raw and urgent. She cut across the muddy yard, boots sinking, branches whipping her arms. The edge of the woods loomed ahead, black, tangled, alive with shadows. And then, in a sudden burst of lightning, she saw them. A wild Mustang mare, her coat slick with rain and streaked with blood, stood with legs braced and head low, shielding a trembling, impossibly small foal. The mare's eyes flashed white in the darkness, nostrils flaring, every muscle straining. Around them, ghostly shapes flickered in and out of the storm. Wolves, maybe half a dozen, their eyes catching the light, circling tighter. Ella didn't stop to think. She shouted, waving the flashlight. But the wolves barely flicked their ears. She raised the flare gun, breath held, and fired. The flare exploded overhead, painting the clearing in wild, pulsing red. The wolves scattered, tails tucked, melting back into the woods. Now, closer, Ella's boots slid in the mud as she approached the mare. "Easy," she whispered, voice trembling but steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." Hope's flanks heaved, sides marked by deep cuts from rope and, likely, sharp hooves. The foal, barely able to stand, pressed against her, legs buckling. Ella dropped to one knee, setting her kit where Hope could see it. The rain was relentless, washing blood into muddy rivulets. Ella's hands worked quickly. She sliced through the cruel rope knotted tight around the mare's chest, murmuring comfort she wasn't sure the animal could understand. Hope shivered, but didn't bolt. "Hang in there, girl. I've got you," Ella breathed, feeling the raw power and terror in the horse's trembling body. She checked the foal. Cold, breathing shallow, but alive. The mare's ears flicked, muscles bunching, but she let Ella's hands find the little one, scooping him gently into her arms. The mud made every step a battle. The foal, brave she'd call him if they made it, was almost too weak to struggle, his head heavy against Ella's chest. Hope limped alongside, eyes wild but fixed on her baby. The three of them stumbled through the darkness, thunder chasing at their heels. Halfway back, the wolves' howls rose again, farther now, but still hungry. Ella's heart pounded. She half expected Hope to bolt, to turn on her, but instead, the mare pressed closer, shoulder brushing Ella's arm as if she understood. Together was their only hope. The porch light gleamed like a lighthouse. Ella burst into the yard, almost falling, arms aching, lungs burning. She wrenched the barn door open, guiding Hope inside, slamming the latch against the wind. Inside it was warm, close, thick with the smells of hay and earth and old, familiar fear. Ella laid Brave on a pile of blankets, grabbing towels, rubbing him down, working by feel and memory as much as sight. Hope circled, nostrils flared, but she stayed. She stayed. Ella cleaned the wounds on the mare's legs, whispered to her, dared to stroke her rain-soaked mane. For a long time there was nothing but the sound of breathing, rain on the roof, distant thunder rolling away into the night. Ella sat on the barn floor, mud caked on her jeans, shivering, watching the rise and fall of Brave's chest, the way Hope finally settled, one eye always on her child. Somewhere in the storm's dying echo, Ella realized she was crying, quietly, not with sadness, but with the wild relief of having chosen to run into darkness instead of hiding from it. She pressed her forehead to the rough boards, breathing in the scent of horse, of mud, of something lost, and maybe tonight, something found. The storm faded to a dull, distant rumble by the time dawn stretched a gray light across whispering pines. The barn felt heavy with exhaustion and hope. Ella sat beside the little foal, Brave, wrapped in towels and still trembling, his breaths shallow and uneven. Hope, the Mustang mare, stood guard a few feet away, her ears twitching at every small sound. The shelter had never felt more alive, or more tense. Ella's hands worked through muscle memory, moving from task to task without rest. She cleaned the cuts along Hope's legs with antiseptic, wincing at the sight of raw skin and old rope burns. The mare pinned her ears, nostrils flaring, but let Ella work, so long as her foal was never out of sight. "I know, girl. I know you're scared," Ella whispered, fingers gentle but steady. "I'd be scared too." The foal was another challenge. Brave's eyes fluttered open and closed, unfocused, legs twitching in dreams or pain. He was dangerously cold, his gums pale when Ella checked, a sure sign of shock. She moved fast, heating water bottles, building a nest of hay and blankets, rubbing him down to stimulate circulation. Every few minutes, she checked his pulse, talking to him in low, encouraging tones. "You're a fighter, little one. You made it through the night. You can make it through this." Hope watched Ella's every move with a mix of fierce suspicion and grudging trust. She snorted and pawed the straw, but she never attacked. Maybe she remembered Ella's hands freeing her from those ropes. Maybe she recognized something desperate and tired in the woman's eyes. For now they had an uneasy truce. As the sky turned from gunmetal to pearl, Ella forced herself to pause. She took shaky notes in her battered field journal. Date, time, weather, wounds treated, temperature of the foal, signs of improvement. It was a habit drilled into her by years in vet school and urban clinics. Document everything, trust nothing to memory. But as she wrote, a shadow crossed the barn door. A flashlight beam swept across the hay. "Miss Carter!" a deep, authoritative voice called. Ella jumped, her hands frozen mid-sentence. The door creaked open, letting in a rush of cold air, and the local sheriff, rain-spattered, face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Sheriff Dalton," Ella said, forcing herself to stand. She felt suddenly self-conscious. Mud streaked across her jeans, her hair wild from the night's storm, exhaustion carved deep into her face. Dalton glanced at the horses, his gaze lingering on the wild mare and the barely breathing foal. "We had calls from folks down the road," he said. "Heard gunshots, saw a flare. Some worried you were in trouble. Others figured you'd gone and got yourself mixed up in something you shouldn't." Ella's mouth went dry. She squared her shoulders. I fired the flare to scare off a wolf pack. They had this mare and her foal surrounded. I couldn't let them die out there. He stepped inside, boots leaving muddy prints, eyes hard on hers. You know the law, right? About wild horses. You're not supposed to interfere even for rescue. It's federal. Folks get jumpy about outsiders, even well-meaning ones. Ella swallowed. I understand the rules, Sheriff, but these two would have been torn apart if I hadn't acted. I did what I had to do. If you want to arrest me, go ahead. But I'm not letting either of them die. For a long, tense moment, Dalton said nothing. He walked slowly around the barn, examining the scene. The field notes, the medical supplies, the half-unpacked rescue kit. Hope bared her teeth and stamped a warning, but the sheriff kept a safe distance. Brave shivered, his breathing thin but steady. Finally, Dalton sighed. Not here to arrest you, not yet anyway. But I have to file a report. Someone from wildlife enforcement will be out. You'll need to explain yourself, maybe more than once. Not everyone's as understanding as I am. This is a small town, Miss Carter. Folks talk, folks judge. Ella nodded, relief warring with a fresh stab of anxiety. I'll cooperate with whoever you send. I'll show them my records, let them inspect the horses. Please, Sheriff, let me keep working. Every minute matters. He gave her a long look, something softening in his weathered features. For now. But keep your phone on, and don't try to move them without permission. You hear? She nodded, and Dalton left with a last glance at the mare. Take care, Miss Carter, and good luck. After the door closed, Ella sagged against the wall. Her body ached in places she'd forgotten existed. She looked at Hope, then at Brave, and felt the weight of what she'd done settle like a stone in her chest. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, hands shaking as she checked Brave's vitals again and again. Hope flinched at every approach, but allowed Ella to gently lift the foal's head, help him drink a little warm water mixed with glucose. Hours passed. At one point, Ella rested her head on her arms beside Brave, letting exhaustion overtake her for a few minutes. When she woke, the barn was bathed in slanted sunlight. Brave struggled, then slowly pushed himself up, legs quivering, wobbling upright for the first time. Hope nickered, a soft, hopeful sound, and Ella felt tears prickle behind her eyes. She kept her distance, letting the two nuzzle, the fragile thread of trust holding steady between woman and wild. By sunset, Ella finished her notes, cleaned her hands, and sat quietly beside the makeshift pen, watching mother and foal. The fear of what might come, legal battles, angry townsfolk, the uncertainty of tomorrow, lingered. But for tonight, a life had been saved. And that, Ella thought, would have to be enough. The storm was a memory now, but its effects lingered in every corner of Ella's small shelter. The world outside had that crisp, post-rain freshness, as if everything, grass, trees, sky, had been scrubbed clean. But inside, the barn was thick with uncertainty. Ella spent the next few days moving between exhaustion and determination. Her routine became relentless. Wake before dawn, check Brave's temperature and heart rate, coax him to nurse from Hope, clean wounds, change bandages, log every detail. She worried constantly, not just about the horse's health, but about her own decision, what it would cost her, what the town thought, what would happen if the authorities decided she'd crossed an unspoken line. Loneliness crept in during quiet moments. She missed her friends from the city, the easy confidence she used to have. Here in this tight-knit, slow-moving town, she felt watched. The local grocery clerk, once warm and chatty, now just nodded stiffly when Ella came in for supplies. A neighbor who used to wave across the road now stared a second too long before going back inside. Ella knew the rumors were swirling, fueled by her late-night flair, the sheriff's visit, and her reputation as the outsider with too much education and too little sense of boundaries. Still, every time she felt her confidence waver, she looked at Hope and Brave. There was something about the mare's eyes, wild, wary, intelligent. She wasn't a pet. She was a survivor, and Ella was determined to be worthy of her fragile trust. To make the shelter safer, Ella got to work on repairs and improvements. The fence had been damaged in the storm, and she couldn't risk a repeat of that terrifying night. She reinforced the paddock with new wire, checked every post, and added a second lock to the barn door. When she wasn't caring for the horses, she was sawing, hammering, or hauling supplies, sweat soaking her shirt even in the cool mornings. The ache in her arms and back felt honest, proof that she wasn't giving up. Hope grew stronger by the day. The wounds on her legs scabbed over, and she learned to move more comfortably, though she flinched at sudden noises or any approach that seemed too fast. Brave became more alert, his eyes bright, legs steadier. Ella began documenting their progress in photos, filling her phone's memory with images of Brave's first unsteady steps, Hope's cautious curiosity, the slow transformation from fear to something that looked almost like hope. Ella kept her notes in a thick, battered notebook. Each entry was precise. Dates, weights, feedings, treatments, behaviors. She recorded every milestone, every setback. She knew this record might be her only defense if wildlife officials came looking for evidence of neglect or mishandling. But the act of writing was also something more, a way to quiet her doubts, to remind herself that every small victory mattered. On the third evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, Ella sat on the barn floor, legs stretched out, watching Hope and Brave doze in the straw. She could hear the distant sounds of the town, someone mowing a lawn, a dog barking, the faint hum of an ATV on the highway. Here it was peaceful, but outside she knew opinions were hardening. The first gossip reached her through Mrs. Adler, the widow who ran the diner and never missed a thing. "People are talking, honey," Mrs. Adler said, pouring Ella a mug of coffee when she stopped in for a quick breakfast. "Some say you're reckless, that you're risking those horses and your own future meddling like this." Ella tried to smile. "And what do you think?" Mrs. Adler shrugged. "I think most folks just don't like change, or outsiders, or someone who makes them feel like they ought to do more." Ella stirred her coffee. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I just couldn't walk away." Mrs. Adler patted her hand. "That's what scares them." Back at the shelter, the sense of isolation pressed down. Ella found herself speaking out loud more, explaining her actions to Hope and Brave as if they might understand. "I know this is hard, but we're going to get through it, one day at a time." The act of talking made the barn feel less empty. One night, as she journaled under the dim barn light, Ella wrote something she hadn't been able to admit to herself. "Maybe this is my second chance too. Maybe saving you will save me." She found comfort in the horse's small, wild rituals, Hope's careful circling before she lay down, Brave's playful attempts to nip at her tail, the way both pressed close to each other, as if drawing strength from touch. Ella began to sense their moods, learning the subtle signs of trust, a flicked ear, a relaxed sigh, a tentative step closer when she entered the stall. Not everyone was hostile. A few neighbors left apples or carrots on her porch. No note but a silent gesture of support. The mail carrier, a quiet man named Tom, asked careful questions about Brave's health. Still, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that she was being weighed, measured, and perhaps found wanting by people she barely knew. On the fifth night, After mending the paddock gate, Ella lay on the cool barn floor, listening to the breathing of Hope and Brave. In the half-light, she realized how much she'd changed in just a few days. She wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for something worth saving. The trust between them was still delicate, always one misstep from breaking. But as Brave curled up beside his mother, and Hope finally relaxed enough to doze with her head low, Ella felt something bloom inside her, a fragile, hard-won sense of belonging. She closed her eyes, holding on to the silence, to the sound of the wild just outside her door, to the hope that tomorrow she could keep building on the fragile trust they'd found in the aftermath of a storm. Ella had always prided herself on being resourceful, but even she knew some situations called for backup. As days slipped by in a haze of feeding, cleaning, and nervous glances at the road, she felt the weight of uncertainty growing. The sheriff's warning replayed in her mind, sharpening her anxiety with each sunrise. Rules and regulations, eyes watching from every window. The possibility that Hope and Brave could be taken away for her own reckless kindness. She couldn't do this alone. Not anymore. One early morning, as dew still clung to the grass and Brave nuzzled close to his mother's side, Ella opened her laptop at the kitchen table. She searched for wild horse rescue groups, scrolling past glossy headlines and dramatic images. Finally, she found the Western Mustang Alliance, a regional nonprofit known for advocacy and practical help. She typed out her story with shaking hands, her late-night rescue, the wounds, the sheriff's visit, her fears about violating laws. She attached photos and medical logs, then pressed send. That day stretched on forever. Between chores, Ella checked her email every half hour. She tried to busy herself, building enrichment toys from old feed buckets for Brave, organizing supplies, even baking a batch of lumpy biscuits just for the ritual of doing something normal. The horses were thriving, but she could sense Hope's nerves. Each passing car made the mare tense, eyes rolling, body blocking Brave from view. Ella spoke softly as she worked. "I know it's hard to trust, Hope, but I promise I won't let anyone hurt you." In the late afternoon, her phone finally buzzed. The message was direct and kind. "We're here for you, Ella. We have experience dealing with local officials. You did the right thing. Stay calm." Relief swept through her, leaving her knees weak. Less than 24 hours later, a state wildlife officer drove up in a mud-spattered SUV. Ella recognized the woman from her ID badge. Officer Ramirez, boots worn, face serious, eyes sharp and alert. She moved with quiet authority as she approached the barn, clipboard in hand. "Ella Carter?" Ramirez asked, glancing at the horses. Ella nodded, feeling her mouth go dry. "That's me. This is Hope. And Brave." Ramirez walked the paddock, her gaze flicking from the fresh repairs on the fence to the way Hope hovered between Ella and the foal. She checked the records, flipping through pages, scanning Ella's careful notes and printed photos. "You keep good documentation," Ramirez said, her tone still official, but not unfriendly. "I try," Ella answered, unable to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I know I might have broken some rules, but—" Ramirez raised a hand, stopping her. "I'm not here to punish you. My job is to make sure these animals are healthy and not being exploited. From what I see, you've done everything right, by them and by the book. But I do need to file a report. I'll be straight with you. Some people will still want these horses removed. So be ready." Ella exhaled, a mix of dread and gratitude swirling in her chest. "Thank you. That's all I ask. A fair look." Ramirez nodded. She took more photos, watched Hope and Brave move together, and asked Ella about their routines and enrichment. When Hope spooked at a sudden gust and placed herself between Brave and the officer, Ramirez smiled, almost approvingly. She's got good instincts, protective. That's how they survive in the wild. With the inspection finished, Ramirez lingered. Have you thought about involving the community? It could help to get some locals on your side. Show them what wild horses are really like. Ella hesitated. They're not exactly lining up to visit. Ramirez shrugged. Start with the kids. Sometimes the adults follow. And the Mustang Alliance is organizing a regional event next month. I can put in a good word. Get you a slot to speak if you want it. After Ramirez left, Ella sat for a long time in the quiet barn, thinking. She watched Brave test his legs, kicking at the straw, while Hope chewed slowly, still wary but no longer desperate. Maybe she could do more than just defend herself. Maybe she could teach. The next weekend, Ella made a flyer, handwritten, a little shaky, but honest. Wild Horse Open Barn. Come meet Hope and Brave. Learn about Mustangs and how to protect them. She posted it at the grocery, the diner, the gas station. She called the library and offered to give a talk for local kids. At first, no one came. Then, on a sunny Saturday, 3 children showed up, shepherded by a tired-looking mom. Ella welcomed them into the paddock, showing them how to move slowly, how to watch for the signs of trust or fear. Brave was shy but curious, edging close when a little girl offered him a carrot. Ella explained the difference between wild and domestic horses, how families like Hope and Brave lived free, how poaching and trafficking were real threats. The kids asked questions, wide-eyed, soaking up every word. The mother thanked Ella afterward, promising to tell her friends. Word spread slowly. Volunteers from the high school's animal club asked to help muck stalls. A retired rancher brought bales of hay and stood by the fence, nodding silently at Ella's patient work. Officer Ramirez stopped by with updates and praise, sometimes slipping into easy conversation about her own childhood on a ranch. Not everyone was convinced. At the diner, Ella overheard harsh whispers. City girl showing off. Doesn't know the land. Horses should be left wild. But she noticed something else, too. People who listened, who nodded thoughtfully, who left the barn smiling and hopeful. A network was forming, imperfect, but real. Ella felt herself changing, too. Less isolated, more confident. When she looked at Hope and Brave, she saw not just survival, but a future. One she was building, day by day, with every hand that reached out in understanding. The days after the open barn were warmer, filled with cautious optimism. Ella found herself settling into something that almost resembled a rhythm, feeding, cleaning, teaching volunteers how to move among Mustangs, and answering the wide-eyed questions of local kids. For the first time since she'd moved to Whispering Pines, she felt herself breathing a little easier. Maybe, she thought, as she watched Brave chase sunbeams across the paddock, things were going to be all right. But trouble, she knew from a lifetime of setbacks, never stayed gone for long. One evening, after the last visitors had left and the horses were content in their stalls, Ella lingered in the fading light, scribbling fresh notes in her battered journal. She was just about to close up for the night when Hope's restless snort caught her attention. The mare paced at the far end of the paddock, ears pinned, body tense. Brave, still young but growing bolder every day, hovered behind her, uncertain. Ella scanned the yard. At first she saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the lengthening shadows of the pine trees, the golden haze of sunset. Then, near the fence line, something unusual caught her eye. Deep, fresh hoof prints in the mud, alongside the unmistakable impression of boot tracks. She knelt, her breath tight in her chest, running a finger over the damp earth. These weren't from any of the volunteers. She knew every pair of boots that belonged to her helpers, and these prints were too large. The tread unfamiliar. More worrying still, the hoofprints trailed off into the woods, farther than Hope or Brave ever wandered while she watched them. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the barn made Ella's heart jump. At one point, she heard a distant engine rev, then cut out. Maybe someone driving off. Maybe just her nerves playing tricks. She lay awake, clutching her phone, wishing for the protection of city streetlights and neighbors close enough to hear a cry for help. In the morning, she tried to shake off the dread, focusing on chores and company. But Hope remained agitated, pacing, calling out sharply whenever a stranger approached, and shying away even from familiar volunteers. Ella set up her old trail camera, the kind she used to use for observing wildlife, pointing it at the paddock's far edge. She hoped it was nothing, just local kids or a lost hiker, she told herself. Still, she left the barn lights burning through the night. Her fears were confirmed 2 days later when she checked the camera footage. The video, grainy in the moonlight, showed 2 masked men slipping through the trees. One carried a bag, the other a rope. They moved with the wary caution of people who knew they weren't supposed to be there. Heads turning, bodies tense. The horses woke, Hope placing herself between Brave and the intruders, calling out in warning. The men tried to coax the Mustangs closer, tossing out what looked like feed, but Hope refused, stamping and snorting, keeping Brave away. The men left after several minutes, melting back into the woods just as quickly as they had appeared. Ella's hands shook as she replayed the footage, bile rising in her throat. There was no mistaking their intent. These weren't curious kids. They were poachers, illegal traffickers who targeted wild Mustangs for profit. Panic warred with anger. Ella called Officer Ramirez at once. "You need to see this," she said, barely recognizing her own voice. Ramirez arrived within the hour, jaw clenched as she reviewed the video. "You did the right thing, Ella. We've had reports of Mustang trafficking in counties west of here. Usually they wait until a horse is docile, like after a rescue. I'll file an incident report and request extra patrols, but you need to be careful, and so do the horses." That night, Ella didn't leave the barn. She rolled out her sleeping bag in the tack room, a flashlight, and her old flare gun at arm's reach. Every hour, she checked on Hope and Brave, whispering comfort to the mare when she spooked at the slightest sound. "I won't let them take you. Not now, not ever." She doubled the security, replacing the paddock gate's latch with a reinforced lock, and strung up motion sensor lights around the perimeter. She called every neighbor she trusted, asking them to keep an eye out for strangers, and gave Officer Ramirez regular updates on any suspicious activity. She even made a point of telling Sheriff Dalton, whose gruff response still managed to reassure her, "Don't worry, Miss Carter. No one's taking those horses without a fight from us." Hope's anxiety only grew, but she now seemed to look to Ella for reassurance, her eyes following Ella's every move, her body shifting protectively whenever someone new appeared. Brave picked up on his mother's fear, but hid it behind a veneer of foalish curiosity, often darting behind Hope and peeking out, as if daring the world to try him. Ella's sleep was shallow, broken by nightmares of masked men and the sound of hooves thundering away into darkness. She wrote everything down, her fears, the strange noises in the woods, the faces she remembered from the grainy footage. The weight of responsibility pressed on her chest, but she refused to give in to fear. In rare moments of calm, Ella realized how much things had changed since that first wild storm. She was no longer just an outsider or an amateur rescuer. She was their last line of defense, and as Hope pressed her muzzle to Ella's hand before dawn, just a brief, trembling moment of trust, Ella knew she'd do anything to keep them safe, no matter how dark the shadows grew. The nights grew longer. By the time a waning moon hung low above whispering pines, Ella had become half nocturnal herself. She moved through her shelter in a state of restless alertness, flashlight in one hand, phone in the other, ears tuned for any unnatural sound. She slept little, dozing in snatches beside Hope and Brave, comforted by the warm, earthy smell of horses and the knowledge that, if anything happened, she would be there, ready. The extra patrols helped. Officer Ramirez stopped by almost every evening, sometimes just driving slowly past, sometimes coming in for a quick word of reassurance. Still, Ella could sense the unease in the air, the way Hope's body tensed at every distant howl or snapping branch, the way Brave pressed close to his mother in the dark. Ella's own fear hardened into a kind of stubborn resolve. Then, on a Tuesday night painted in cold silver and deep shadow, everything changed. It was close to midnight. Ella had just finished checking the perimeter, making sure the motion sensor lights were armed, when Hope's frantic whinny cut through the silence. Ella's heart slammed into her ribs. She grabbed her phone and her car keys. She'd left the old Jeep parked at the top of the drive, headlights aimed at the barn as a deterrent. She ran, feet pounding, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. As she burst out of the barn, the alarms shrieked, a high, piercing sound that bounced off the trees. The paddock lights flicked on, dazzling the darkness. Two men, faces hidden behind scarves and hoods, were at the fence, wire cutters in hand. One had almost sliced through the last strand of steel. The other was already inside the paddock, moving low and fast toward Brave. "Get away from them!" Ella shouted, her voice raw, almost breaking. She sprinted to the Jeep, flicked the high beams on, and angled the lights to flood the paddock. The men staggered, caught in the glare, shielding their faces. Hope's scream filled the night, a wild, primal sound. The mare charged, hooves pounding, head lowered. She put herself squarely between the men and Brave, rearing up as one lunged at her. The intruder stumbled back, hands raised in instinctive fear. Even from across the yard, Ella could see Hope's eyes rolling, her muscles bunching, every inch of her screaming defiance. Ella fumbled with her phone, hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. 911. She tried to keep her voice steady as she gave her name, her address, the words tumbling out. "They're here. They're trying to take the horses. Please hurry." The poacher outside the fence cursed and tried to make a break for it, but Ella set off the car alarm and began blaring the horn, making as much noise as possible. The whole valley seemed to echo with sound. The second man scrambled back, nearly tripping as Hope lashed out with her hooves. Brave, terrified, pressed against the far corner of the paddock. Ella fought the urge to run to him, knowing that would only make her a target. Instead, she grabbed her old flare gun, aimed it skyward, and fired. The flare exploded in a burst of red light, falling like a comet, casting weird shadows and drawing the attention of anyone within miles. The men panicked. One bolted for the woods, disappearing into the trees. The other tried to scramble over the paddock fence, but in his hurry, his foot caught on the wire, and he tumbled hard to the ground, knocking the wind out of himself. Ella kept the high beams on him, heart pounding, the adrenaline making her vision swim. Within minutes, though it felt like hours, the wail of a siren cut through the night. Sheriff Dalton's cruiser barreled down the lane, followed by Officer Ramirez's SUV. They leapt from their vehicles, guns drawn, and the downed poacher was swiftly handcuffed and hauled to his feet, still gasping for breath. Dalton swept the area with a flashlight, but the second man was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "Is everyone all right?" Ramirez called, breathless, eyes scanning the paddock. Ella nodded, clutching the fence for support. "We're shaken, but hope. She protected Brave. She charged them. She saved him." Ramirez stepped into the paddock, speaking in low, soothing tones. Hope, still trembling, let the officer approach, never taking her eyes off the place where the poachers had vanished. Brave, sensing it was safe, limped over to Ella, pressing his muzzle to her chest. The officers collected evidence, boot prints, wire cutters, a dropped hat, and questioned Ella about every detail. The attempted theft became breaking news almost instantly. By sunrise, a local reporter was at the gate, camera crew in tow, wanting the story of the hero vet and her wild horses. Ella answered questions she could barely remember later, adrenaline still running wild through her veins. As the reporters left and the shelter returned to quiet, the gravity of what had happened settled in her bones. The community rallied around her. Neighbors brought food and blankets. Volunteers showed up in greater numbers. And even the skeptics seemed impressed by Hope's bravery and Ella's quick thinking. But with attention came controversy. Some locals argued wild horses didn't belong so close to people. Others insisted Ella had done what anyone with a heart would do. For the first time, her actions were public knowledge. Her fight, her fear, her resilience laid bare. That night, as Ella checked the locks and lingered with Hope and Brave, she stroked the mare's neck, whispering, "Thank you, Hope. You're not just a survivor. You're a warrior." The world outside the shelter might still be dangerous, but inside, Ella knew she and her small herd would never back down. Not now. Not ever. The chaos of the night before left a deep mark on Ella's spirit. She barely slept, mind racing through every possibility. What would happen to Hope and Brave now that the world knew about them? Was she going to lose everything she'd fought for, just when she'd found a fragile purpose again? By sunrise, the shelter was a flurry of activity. Reporters snapped photos of the patched fence. Neighbors stopped by with coffee and offers to help, and Ella did her best to answer questions through the fog of exhaustion. Brave stayed close to Hope, his little head peeking from behind her flank whenever new faces appeared. Ella couldn't blame him for being wary. After what they'd endured, trust was hard-earned and easily lost. Officer Ramirez was the first to bring up the next storm on the horizon. "Ella, you need to be prepared," she said quietly, standing just inside the barn, her boots still muddy from a night spent tracking footprints through the woods. With all this media attention, the state wildlife officials have no choice. They'll do a formal review of your case. Someone from the Bureau will visit, check your logs, inspect the horses, and decide if you've broken any federal or state laws by sheltering them. Ella swallowed, feeling her stomach twist. I knew this might happen. I just didn't think it'd be so soon." Ramirez's gaze softened. "You did everything right by them, Ella. That counts for something. But it's going to get political. Not everyone cares as much as you do." Within days, the official letter arrived. White envelope, crisp government seal, a date set for the review hearing. Ella barely read the rest before sinking into her kitchen chair, hands trembling. The whole town seemed to know by sundown. Some were openly supportive, dropping by with hand-drawn signs or baskets of muffins. Others kept their distance, making no secret of their suspicion. Ella braced herself for battle. She called the Western Mustang Alliance, who connected her with a passionate attorney and several Mustang advocacy groups. They advised her to gather every record, every receipt for feed and medicine, every photo of Brave's recovery. With Ramirez's help, she compiled everything into a thick folder, a timeline of care, proof that every action was driven by necessity not defiance. Word of the upcoming hearing spread. A local journalist who'd witnessed the poacher's arrest published a story framing Ella as a champion for wild horses. Within a week, an online petition had sprung up, "Let Hope and Brave Stay," gaining hundreds, then thousands of signatures. Animal lovers from around the country sent messages of encouragement. For every nasty comment in the news, there were two from strangers urging her to keep fighting. Still, Ella knew public support didn't guarantee a happy ending. She spent long nights in the barn, journaling through her fears, imagining every outcome. What if the review board sided with the critics? What if they took Hope and Brave away? Would she ever recover from losing them, after everything they'd been through together? The day of the inspection dawned clear and cold. Ella wore her cleanest jeans and her old veterinary coat, the one with faded embroidery from her city days. She brushed Hope until the mare gleamed, then braided Brave's forelock, hoping he looked as healthy and spirited as she knew he felt. The shelter volunteers lined up the feed and medical supplies, and even Sheriff Dalton showed up, leaning on the fence with a stoic nod. The wildlife officials arrived in a pair of state SUVs. They were polite but distant, notebooks ready, cameras slung over their shoulders. The lead inspector, a tall man with sharp glasses, walked the property with a practiced eye. He questioned Ella on every detail: diet, exercise, medical interventions, the night of the rescue, the attempted poaching. He photographed every corner of the shelter, took copies of her notes, and watched as Brave trotted after Hope with a burst of coltish energy. "You realize," the inspector said at last, "these horses aren't meant for captivity, no matter how temporary. Federal law is clear." Ella stood her ground. "I know, but I also know that if I hadn't stepped in, they'd both be dead. And since then, I've only done what was necessary to heal and protect them." He nodded, jotting something down, unreadable. "We'll make our recommendation soon. In the meantime, do not move them or interfere with further inspections. Understand?" Ella nodded, relief and dread twisting inside her. After the officials left, the shelter seemed to hold its breath. Brave pressed close to Ella, snuffling at her pocket until she found a sugar cube. Hope nickered softly, as if sensing her anxiety. That evening, Ella posted a public update on the petition site, sharing what had happened and asking for continued support. The response was overwhelming. Comments from strangers telling their own rescue stories, offering prayers, legal advice, and donations to keep her shelter afloat. Volunteers organized a small rally in front of the town hall, holding up signs with hand-painted Mustangs. Ella watched from the shelter, fighting tears as cars honked in support. The wait for the verdict stretched on. Ella filled the anxious days with action, teaching the volunteers, building enrichment obstacles for Brave, answering interview requests, and carefully preparing a speech for the review board. She told the story of Hope and Brave to anyone who would listen, focusing not on herself, but on the resilience of the horses and the importance of humane rescue. One night, as she walked the perimeter in the hush before dawn, Ramirez pulled up beside her in the patrol car. "I heard from someone inside the department," she said, voice low. "Your petition is making a difference. They're feeling the pressure, not just from the media, but from the people in this town. Don't give up hope, Ella." Ella smiled, though her heart was pounding. "I won't. I promise." She looked over at Hope and Brave, silhouetted against the rising sun. Whatever happened, she would keep fighting for them, for all the wild horses who needed a friend in the darkness. Even as she braced for the outcome, she let herself believe, just for a moment, that justice was possible, and hope, once kindled, was a force even stronger than fear. Dawn came soft and golden over whispering pines, stretching pale fingers across the paddock where Hope and Brave stood side by side. It had been weeks since the standoff with the poachers, and somehow, despite fear and legal threats and the buzz of local gossip, both horses were thriving. Brave had lost the coltish wobble in his legs, his coat now glossy, eyes bright and sharp, with a young Mustang's fire. Hope's old wounds had nearly vanished, leaving only faint scars and a fierce new confidence in her step. But inside Ella's chest, a different ache grew. The state hearing had been tense. Her records spread across the long table, officials poring over every note and photo, advocates and critics arguing in low, urgent voices. Ella spoke her truth, that she'd acted from compassion, that wild horses deserved care and dignity, not indifference or brutality. In the end, it wasn't just her voice that tipped the scales, but the overwhelming support from the community. Petitions signed by hundreds, neighbors and strangers alike, volunteers and children who had visited, local ranchers and even the sheriff himself. The final decision came late one afternoon, Officer Ramirez handing her the printed letter with a rare, hopeful smile. Ella was granted permission to oversee the rewilding process. Hope and Brave could return to the wild, free, on Ella's terms, with care, safety, and dignity. Ella knew it was the right thing. She'd always known deep down that Hope and Brave weren't hers to keep. But letting go, that was another story. She spent her final week with them, preparing for their release. Volunteers came daily, helping Ella build a simple but sturdy holding pen on the edge of the open range, far from the reach of poachers and roads. She met with Officer Ramirez and 2 wildlife specialists, planning every step of the transition, transport, acclimation, how and when to open the gate. Brave's energy was uncontainable, his curiosity wild and joyful, but Hope stayed close to Ella, as if she sensed something big was coming. The night before the farewell, Ella barely slept. She wandered the paddock under starlight, hand on Hope's strong neck, feeling the mare's calm heartbeat and Brave's warm breath at her elbow. She whispered thanks, promises, apologies, things she'd never say to another person, things only a horse might understand. You saved each other. You saved me, too. I'll always watch for you out there. When morning came, the air shimmered with a sense of ceremony. People gathered at the edge of the woods, friends, volunteers, even skeptics drawn by curiosity or something softer. Kids from the library waved handmade banners, one reading, "Run free, Hope and Brave." Officer Ramirez helped manage the crowd, keeping things quiet and respectful. Ella opened the trailer gate slowly, heart pounding. Hope stepped out first, wary but unafraid, Brave at her side. They paused just inside the holding pen, sunlight catching in their manes. Ella waited for the world to hold its breath. She knelt by Brave, pressing her forehead to his, holding him for one last brief moment. Then she straightened, looking into Hope's deep, watchful eyes. "You're ready," she said, voice soft but certain. "Take care of him. Take care of yourself. I'll be watching the hills." Officer Ramirez gave Ella a nod. The crowd grew quiet as she lifted the latch on the far gate. For a moment, Hope stood frozen, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Then, with one final look back, a long, searching glance that seemed to hold gratitude and understanding, she led Brave into the wild, slipping through the gate and into the open, rolling country. The horses ran, first slow, then stretching into a wild, beautiful gallop, manes and tails flying. Ella watched, tears streaming down her face as they crested the first hill and paused, outlined against the sky. Hope looked back, and for a heartbeat, Ella felt every memory crash over her. The storm, the fear, the fights, the small victories, the endless waiting. Brave nickered, and then they disappeared, two dark shapes vanishing into the golden morning. People cheered, some cried. The moment was caught on a dozen phones. The video shared widely, sparked debates, inspired stories, started conversations far beyond Whispering Pines. Ella hugged volunteers, shook hands with the sheriff, let herself be embraced by children and old friends. The grief was sharp, but it was matched by a deep, sweet pride. That evening, Ella sat alone on the fence, watching the last light fade over the empty paddock. There was an emptiness now. No Hope's steady gaze. No Brave's eager calls. But there was peace, too. She'd kept her promise. She'd done what was right, even though it broke her heart. She'd let them go. Somewhere out there, wild horses ran. Maybe tomorrow, she'd catch a glimpse. Just a flash of movement among the trees, a black mane, a white blaze. Hope's unmistakable silhouette. Ella would remember this day for the rest of her life. The day she gave everything she had for two wild souls, and finally set them free. The days after Hope and Brave's release blurred together, but Ella remembered them not for the emptiness, but for the surprising sense of peace that settled in her chest. For the first time since she'd arrived in Whispering Pines, she felt something like belonging. The barn, though quiet, was filled with the echoes of hoofbeats, laughter, and the kind of energy that lingers after something important has happened. At first, she moved through her routines automatically, still half expecting to hear Brave's playful whinny or find Hope waiting patiently at the gate for her morning treat. But when she looked out across the fields, she saw nothing but the wide, wild country. And that, she reminded herself, was exactly as it should be. Ella poured herself into her work. She tended to other rescues, an abandoned mule, a stray dog with a twisted paw, a family of orphaned barn cats. Each creature reminded her why she'd come here in the first place. Not to control or keep, but to heal, protect, and when the time was right, let go. But she also found herself reflecting more deeply on the journey that had brought her here. Some evenings, she would walk out to the edge of the woods, journal in hand, and sit beneath the old sycamore. She would write about the stormy night when she first heard Hope's desperate cries, about the moments when she doubted herself, and about the strange, fierce love that grew between woman and wild horse. It was in one of those quiet evenings that she wrote an op-ed for the regional newspaper. The piece was honest, raw even, about fear, failure, trust, and the power of letting go. She wrote not just about her own experience, but about the responsibility that came with living near wildness. It isn't about taming what's wild. It's about making space for freedom, for fear and hope to coexist. Sometimes the greatest act of love is to step back and let another creature run. The article struck a chord. Within a week, Ella was invited to speak at a wildlife conference in the city. A daunting prospect, but one she accepted. She wanted others to learn from her mistakes and successes, to understand the messy, human side of animal rescue. On stage, she spoke not as an expert, but as someone who had stumbled, risked everything, and, by grace and grit, helped two wild souls find their way home. Her story spread. Local schools asked her to visit and talk to students about wildlife and ethical rescue. Ranchers who once eyed her with suspicion now dropped off spare bales of hay or waved from their trucks as they passed the shelter. Even Sheriff Dalton showed up one afternoon, leaning against the paddock fence, tipping his hat with a rare, approving smile. "You did good, Ella. Not many folks could have pulled that off." Perhaps the most meaningful change came during the first Wild Horse Awareness Week, an idea proposed by the high school's animal club and quickly embraced by the whole town. Posters appeared in shop windows, and volunteers helped Ella organize educational tours, demonstrations, and even a photo exhibit of Mustangs running free. Children drew pictures of Hope and Brave, and older residents told stories of wild herds from decades past. Through it all, Ella remained humble, aware that real change was slow and always unfinished. She trained new volunteers, sharing not just her knowledge but also her hard-won wisdom about patience and respect. She partnered with Officer Ramirez to host seminars on wildlife law and anti-poaching tactics, bridging the old divide between law enforcement and animal advocates. Officer Ramirez herself became a close friend, an ally Ella trusted not just in emergencies, but with her own moments of doubt and exhaustion. Together, they mentored a new generation of rescuers, teaching them that compassion wasn't weakness, and that standing up for what's right often meant standing alone, at least at first. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridgeline, Ella heard laughter from the barn. A group of teenagers covered in mud and hay were finishing up chores. She watched them, remembering herself at that age, full of certainty and fear, longing for a place to belong. She smiled, realizing she had become what she needed all those years ago. A guide, a steady hand, someone who believed in the possibility of healing. She wasn't the only one changed by Hope and Brave. Whispering Pines itself felt transformed. The conversations at the diner shifted, from small-town gossip to discussions about conservation, responsibility, and the power of a single act of courage. Local regulations were updated to offer stronger protection for Mustangs and other wildlife, with new penalties for poaching and illegal trafficking. The town's sense of pride swelled, not just for Ella, but for the way neighbors had come together, sometimes reluctantly, but always in the end, for something larger than themselves. And sometimes, on the rare mornings when the mist rolled down from the mountains, Ella would catch a glimpse of horses far off on the hills, a dark mare and a young stallion running at her side. She would pause, breath held, and then smile, feeling hope rise in her chest all over again. In the quiet of her shelter, with her animals resting and the world outside turning gently toward night, Ella understood something she'd never known before. True belonging wasn't about fitting in. It was about doing the work, messy, exhausting, lonely, and brave, and finding, in the end, that your small, stubborn kindness could change a corner of the world. Months passed, and the seasons at Whispering Pines shifted. Winter's hush gave way to a soft, green spring, and Ella Carter's animal shelter became more than just a safe haven for lost and wounded creatures. It grew into a beacon, drawing visitors from across the county. Parents brought their children on weekends to help brush the donkeys or bottle feed lambs. Retired ranchers lent their weathered hands for fence repairs or to share stories over strong coffee. Stories that always circled back, somehow, to the wild horses that had run free on these lands long before fences or roads. Ella felt a quiet pride watching her shelter flourish. The place buzzed with the energy of people working together. Volunteers mucking stalls, high schoolers leading tours, a local artist painting a mural of Hope and Brave galloping under an endless blue sky. In her office, letters and photos from strangers lined the walls. Wild horse advocates in Wyoming, a girl in Oregon who had started her own rescue club, even a city mayor thanking her for her op-ed that helped sway a vote on humane animal policies. But Ella's proudest moments were quieter, built from 1,000 small decisions and acts of kindness. She had learned that leadership wasn't about being loud or demanding, but about showing up, listening, and keeping her word. It was about guiding gently, letting others take the lead when they were ready. She found satisfaction in seeing her volunteers grow more confident, watching shy new recruits become bold, compassionate animal advocates. Hope and brave were never far from her mind. Some days she hiked out at dawn, standing at the edge of the high pasture with binoculars, searching the horizon. Once, after a spring rain, she caught sight of them. Hope, unmistakable even from a distance, with her strong, upright stance and glossy black mane. Brave ran at her side, bigger now, wild and free, his muscles rippling beneath his shining coat. Ella's heart clenched and soared at once, seeing the pair lead a small herd, their tails streaming as they vanished into the trees. Those glimpses became bittersweet gifts, reminders that her role had never been to keep, but to care and let go. In the town, the story of Hope and Brave lived on. Their release became a turning point, not just for Ella, but for the whole community. Whispering Pines was changing. There was more talk of conservation at the town hall, more collaboration between citizens and wildlife officials, and a sense of shared responsibility that hadn't existed before. Wild Horse Awareness Week became an annual event, drawing crowds from miles around. Schools planned field trips to Ella's shelter, where students learned about the complex lives of Mustangs, the dangers of poaching, and the power of advocacy. Officer Ramirez, now a close friend and trusted ally, led workshops on animal protection laws, her steady presence a comfort to Ella and an inspiration to the next generation. Ella herself was often asked to speak at conferences and workshops. At first, public speaking made her anxious. She remembered all too well the feeling of being the outsider, the awkwardness of facing rooms full of skeptics. But every time she told her story, the nerves faded, replaced by conviction. She spoke about courage, the kind that meant risking your reputation, your comfort, even your heart for what was right. She talked about trust, not just between humans and animals, but within communities, between neighbors who had once stood on opposite sides of a fence. She reminded listeners that change was never easy, never quick, and never the result of a single person's work. It was a chain reaction, a flare fired in the dark, a moment of compassion, a stubborn refusal to give up even when hope seemed as fragile as a foal in a storm. Back at the shelter, Ella felt those lessons in the quietest moments. Brushing a nervous stray, sharing a laugh with Ramirez over burnt coffee, or sitting on the old fence at sunset. She'd stopped trying to fill every silence with activity. Sometimes she simply listened, to the soft sounds of animals settling in for the night, to the wind in the pines, to the possibility of hooves pounding in the distance. One warm evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ella stood at her fence and watched shadows stretch across the fields. Volunteers packed up for the day, waving as they headed home, and a sense of peace settled over the land. From the far hills came a distant, familiar sound, the high, wild call of mustangs. Ella closed her eyes, picturing Hope and Brave somewhere out there, leading their herd through the tall grass, unbound and unafraid. She smiled, knowing that her greatest legacy wasn't the shelter itself, or the awards now gathering dust in her office, or even the laws that had changed. It was the community, a tapestry of people, young and old, now joined in respect for wildness, and a promise to protect it. As night fell, Ella leaned on the fence, letting the cool air wash over her. She realized she had finally found what she'd been searching for, not by holding tight to what she loved, but by giving it the freedom to grow. True courage, she knew now, was rooted in compassion and strengthened by trust. And sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was to let go and watch as others, human and animal alike, ran free. So she stood there, quiet but content, listening for hoofbeats in the darkness, knowing that her story and hope and braves would echo long after the sun had set.